The chandeliers of Pemberton House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on that April evening in 1814, casting their golden glow upon the assembled cream of London society as they gathered for the opening ball of the season, and among them stood Lady Eleanor Ashworth, 26 years of age, and entering her 5th season with the quiet resignation of one who has long since abandoned hope, her fingers touching the garnet necklace at her throat that had once belonged to her mother, the stones warm against her skin as she watched the dancers swirl past in their silks and satins, knowing that no gentleman would ask her to join them, for she had learned through 4 painful years that a sharp tongue and a modest fortune rendered a woman invisible to men paid of consequence. And so she had positioned herself near the potted palms at the edge of the ballroom, a familiar sanctuary where she might observe without being observed, or so she believed until she became aware of a presence beside her, a tall figure in immaculate evening dress, whose silver-grey eyes regarded her with an expression she could not quite decipher. And she recognized him at once as Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke of Thornhill, recently emerged from mourning for his first wife, and rumoured to be seeking a new duchess with the same cold calculation he applied to his business affairs. And when he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone of aristocratic certainty that suggested he had never in his life been refused anything he desired. "Lady Eleanor," he said without preamble, "I have observed you these past 4 seasons, standing precisely here, watching others dance, and I find myself curious as to why a woman of your obvious intelligence wastes her evenings in such a manner." And Eleanor felt something spark within her chest, not the flutter of attraction, but the familiar fire of indignation at being assessed like horseflesh at Tattersall's. "Your Grace," she replied with deliberate coolness, "perhaps I simply find the conversation of potted palms superior to that of most gentlemen present," and rather than take offence, he smiled, a slight curve of his lips that did not reach those remarkable eyes. "I have a proposition for you," he said, as though discussing the whether you are unwed and unlikely to receive better offers given your circumstances, and I require a wife of adequate breeding who will not bore me with excessive sentiment. I am offering you the position." And for a moment Eleanor could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at this man who spoke of marriage as though it were a business arrangement and expected her gratitude for the opportunity. And then something broke free within her, all the years of being overlooked and dismissed and pitied rising up in a wave of fury that swept away every lesson she had ever learned about decorum and proper behavior. And her voice rang out clear and sharp across the ballroom, cutting through the music and the chatter with the precision of a blade. "I would not marry you for all of London, Your Grace," and the silence that followed was absolute, every eye turning toward them, every fan ceasing its motion, every whispered conversation dying on painted lips. And Eleanor watched the shock register on the Duke's face, the first crack in that perfect aristocratic composure, and she felt a surge of triumph that lasted precisely as long as it took her to realize what she had done. And then the fear came rushing in like cold water, but she lifted her chin and held his gaze, and something flickered in those silver-grey eyes, something that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely, something she would not understand until much later. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it? It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Ashworth townhouse on Half Moon Street was modest by the standards of the ton, its furnishings worn but well maintained, its windows overlooking a narrow garden where Eleanor had spent countless hours reading among the roses, and it was in the small morning room of this house that she sat 2 days after the Pemberton ball, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as her younger sister Harriet paced before the fireplace, one hand pressed to the gentle swell of her belly where her first child grew, and Harriet's face was pale with worry as she recounted what she had heard at Lady Morton's breakfast that very morning. Eleanor, you cannot imagine what they are saying. Lady Beatrice Greville has made it her personal mission to destroy whatever remains of your reputation. She is telling everyone that you are mad, that you have always been peculiar, that father's financial difficulties have driven you to desperate measures designed to attract attention since you could not attract suitors. And Eleanor listened with a strange calm that surprised even herself, for she had expected this, had known from the moment those words left her lips that society would exact its price, and yet she could not bring herself to regret what she had done, could not wish those words unspoken, even as she understood they had likely sealed her fate as a permanent spinster. "He deserved it," she said quietly, and Harriet stopped her pacing to stare at her. "He proposed to me, as though he were offering charity to a beggar, as though I should fall to my knees in gratitude that a duke had deigned to notice my existence." And Harriet sank into the chair across from her, her expression softening into something like understanding mixed with fear. "I know, Eleanor. I know he was insufferably arrogant, but he is the Duke of Thornhill. His influence extends everywhere, if he chooses to ruin us completely." And she did not finish the sentence because she did not need to. They both understood what a powerful enemy could do to a family already teetering on the edge of respectability. But what neither of them knew was that at that very moment across London, in the grand library of Ravenscroft House, the Duke himself was being questioned by his closest friend, Lord Philip Sinclair, who had witnessed the entire debacle, and could not reconcile what he had seen with what he was seeing now. For Frederick stood by the window with a glass of brandy in his hand, and an expression on his face that Philip had never seen before, something that looked almost like admiration. "You are not angry," Philip said slowly. And Frederick turned to look at him with those silver-grey eyes that had made lesser men quake. "I am not angry," he confirmed. "I am intrigued. In 32 years of life, no one has ever refused me anything. Certainly no woman has ever publicly rejected a proposal that would have elevated her beyond her wildest dreams. And yet Lady Eleanor Ashworth looked me in the eye and declared she would not have me for all of London." And Philip shook his head in bewilderment. "So what will you do?" And Frederick smiled that slight smile that did not reach his eyes. "I am going to send her an invitation to Lady Worthington's garden party, and I am going to discover what manner of woman values her pride above a dukedom." And back on Half Moon Street a footman arrived bearing a cream-coloured envelope sealed with the Worthington crest, and Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers to find herself invited to the most exclusive event of the month. Lady Worthington's garden party unfolded beneath a sky of cloudless azure on that warm April afternoon, the lawns immaculate and the flower-beds bursting with the first blooms of spring. And Eleanor had positioned herself at the far edge of the formal gardens, where a magnificent collection of roses grew in orderly profusion, their petals unfurling in shades of cream and pink and deepest crimson. And she had told herself she came here to escape the whispers that followed her everywhere now, the pointed glances and barely concealed smirks of ladies who delighted in her disgrace. But in truth she found solace among the flowers, their beauty unconcerned with her ruined reputation or her diminishing prospects, and she was examining a particularly fine specimen of Rosa Gallica when she became aware that she was no longer alone, and her heart seized in her chest as she recognized those silver-grey eyes watching her with an expression of genuine curiosity, rather than the mockery she had expected. "Your Grace," she said coolly, refusing to let her voice betray the nervous flutter in her stomach. "I confess I did not anticipate you would seek me out again after our last encounter." And Frederick moved closer, his gaze shifting to the rose she had been studying. "Rosa Gallica officinalis," he said. Quietly also known as the apothecary's rose, cultivated since the 13th century for its medicinal properties. And Eleanor could not hide her surprise at this knowledge, staring at him as though seeing him for the first time. "You know your Latin botanical names?" she said, and he smiled that slight smile she was beginning to recognize. "I know many things. Lady Eleanor, though I confess most people do not give me opportunity to demonstrate interests beyond politics and estate management," and something in his tone made her pause. A note of weariness, perhaps, or loneliness that she had not expected from a man of such power and privilege. "Why are you here?" she asked bluntly. Abandoning the pretense of polite conversation, "Why did you arrange for me to receive this invitation when you should, by all rights, be furious with me for what I said?" And Frederick was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the garden before returning to her face. "Because you were honest with me," he said simply. "Because in 32 years of life, surrounded by sycophants and fortune hunters, you are the first person to tell me exactly what you thought of my behavior, regardless of the consequences." And Eleanor felt something shift within her chest, a crack in the armor of suspicion she had built around herself. "You were insufferably arrogant," she said, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I was, and I have spent the past 2 weeks considering why a woman of obvious intelligence and spirit would refuse what most would consider an extraordinary opportunity, and I have concluded that the fault lies not with you, but with my approach." And Eleanor did not know what to say to this, had prepared herself for revenge or mockery, but not for this quiet admission of wrongdoing. And as the warm spring breeze carried the scent of roses between them, Frederick asked her about her interest in botany, and she found herself telling him about the books she had read, the specimens she had pressed and catalogued, the garden at Ashworth Manor where she had spent her childhood summers, and he listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions that revealed a mind far more curious than his cold reputation suggested. And when the time came for him to leave, he took her gloved hand and bowed over it with perfect propriety. "I shall see you again, Lady Eleanor," he said, and though the words might have sounded like a threat from another man from him, they carried the weight of a promise. The final ball of the season arrived on a warm June evening in 1814, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the Whitmore ballroom in her favourite blue gown, a silk the colour of a summer twilight that Harriet had insisted brought out the depths of her eyes, and she watched the dancers whirl past in their glittering finery, while her mind wandered to the strange weeks that had followed the Pemberton ball, weeks in which the Duke of Thornhill had appeared at every gathering she attended, had sought her out in crowded rooms and empty gardens alike, had engaged her in conversations about botany and literature and philosophy until she no longer knew what to make of him or his intentions, and she was so lost in these thoughts that she did not notice his approach until his voice sounded beside her. "Will you dance with me, Lady Eleanor?" And she turned to find those silver-grey eyes watching her with an expression she could not decipher, something that looked almost like hope beneath the cool exterior, and she heard herself refuse before she could consider the wisdom of it. "I think not, Your Grace, for I cannot imagine what purpose it would serve." And instead of taking offence, he smiled that slight smile she had come to know. "Then allow me to tell you my purpose," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "I intend to return next season and the season after that, and every season thereafter, until you agree to give me a chance to prove that I am not the man you met at the Pemberton ball." And Eleanor laughed, though the sound came out breathless and uncertain. "You cannot be serious," she said, and he moved closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I have never been more serious about anything in my life." And before she could respond, a voice cut through the moment like a blade. "How touching," Lady Beatrice Greville drawled from somewhere behind them loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The desperate spinster and her duke playing at courtship. I wonder, does she truly believe he means any of it? Or is she simply grateful for the attention, and Eleanor felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her cheeks. Felt the eyes of a dozen guests turn toward them with hungry curiosity, but before she could speak, Frederick turned to face Lady Beatrice with an expression that made the woman take an involuntary step backward. "Lady Eleanor is the most remarkable woman in this room," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the space. "And I will thank you not to speak of her with anything less than the respect she deserves." And the silence that followed was absolute, every guest within earshot frozen in shock at this public defense, from a man known for his cold indifference, and Lady Beatrice retreated with her face flaming, while Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, unable to process what had just occurred. And when she finally looked at Frederick, she found him watching her with something vulnerable in his expression, something that made her heart clench painfully in her chest. "I will see you next season, Lady Eleanor," he said softly. And then he was gone, leaving her to wonder if perhaps this was not a game after all, if perhaps against all reason and expectation the Duke of Thornhill truly intended to prove her wrong. The morning of April the 15th, 1815, dawned grey and cool, and Eleanor sat in the modest drawing-room of the Ashworth townhouse, with her niece Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms, the infant barely 3 months old, and already the light of everyone's existence. And as Eleanor gazed down at that tiny, perfect face, she felt the familiar ache of longing mixed with resignation, for she was 27 now, and another season stretched before her like a road she had walked too many times. And she was contemplating this melancholy truth when the butler appeared in the doorway bearing a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon of deep green. "A delivery for you, my lady," he said with barely concealed curiosity, and Eleanor shifted Rose carefully to one arm before taking the package with trembling fingers, for she recognized the handwriting on the card tucked beneath the ribbon even before she read the words, and her heart stuttered in her chest as she opened the note to find a simple message in Frederick's precise script. "For your studies of Rosa Gallica and all her sisters," I remembered. And when she tore away the paper, she found a leather-bound volume so beautiful it stole her breath, a comprehensive botanical study of roses with hand-colored illustrations on every page, the kind of book she had admired in shop windows but could never afford, and she was still staring at it in wonder when Harriet entered the room and immediately noticed her sister's expression. "What is it, Eleanor? You look as though you have seen a ghost." And Eleanor could only shake her head and show her the book, unable to explain why this gift from a man she had so publicly rejected felt like the most intimate thing anyone had ever given her. And Harriet's eyes widened with understanding. "He remembered," she said softly. "He remembered what you told him in that garden almost a year ago." And before Eleanor could respond, the butler appeared again this time, announcing Mr. Thomas Colborne. And Eleanor's brief moment of wonder shattered as the man himself strode into the room without waiting for permission. A portly gentleman of 40 with ruddy cheeks and an air of perpetual self-satisfaction. "Lady Eleanor," he declared, "I have come to make you an offer, and I shall not be refused, for I am a patient man, and you are not getting younger." And Eleanor felt the contrast like a physical blow between this clumsy, graceless proposal and the thoughtful gift still warm in her hands. "Mr. Colborne," she said with icy precision, "I believe I have made my feelings clear on previous occasions." "But you cannot mean to refuse me forever," he sputtered. "You are 27, with no fortune to speak of." "What other options remain to you?" And Eleanor rose to her full height, still holding her sleeping niece with a dignity that made even Harriet straighten in her chair. "I would rather remain unmarried for the rest of my days than accept a proposal delivered with such contempt," she said, "and I will thank you to leave this house immediately." And as Thomas Colborne retreated with his face purple with indignation, Eleanor looked down at the botanical book and felt something crack within the walls she had built around her heart, For Frederick Ravenscroft had not forgotten her, had spent the long months between seasons thinking of her interests and her passions, and she thought perhaps this was not a game after all. The musicale at Lady Pemberton's townhouse on the evening of May the 12th, 1815, promised to be an interminable affair, and Eleanor knew this the moment she heard the first wavering notes from Miss Arabella Whitmore's pianoforte, a young lady of more enthusiasm than talent, whose mother had insisted she perform, despite all evidence suggesting this was a grievous error in judgment, and Eleanor had resigned herself to 2 hours of polite suffering when she felt rather than saw Frederick settle into the empty chair beside her, his presence announced by the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something else she could not name, but had come to associate with him alone, and without looking at him, she whispered, "Your timing is impeccable. Your Grace, you have arrived just in time for what promises to be a massacre of Mozart," and she heard his low answering laugh, a sound so quiet only she could catch it. "I confess I bribed the footman to seat me beside you," he murmured back, his breath warm against her ear, which was highly improper, and probably cost me more than the information was worth, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks even as she kept her eyes fixed on the unfortunate Miss Whitmore. Why, she asked, because the question had been burning in her for weeks now. "Why do you persist in this pursuit when I have given you no encouragement whatsoever?" And there was a pause, filled only by a particularly painful arpeggio before Frederick answered, "Because you are the only person who has ever told me the truth." And something in his voice made Eleanor finally turn to look at him. And what she saw in those silver-grey eyes made her breath catch, a rawness she had never expected from a man rumoured to be made of ice. "My first wife," he continued so softly she had to lean closer to hear, "was chosen for me by my mother when I was 22 and she was 18, and we were strangers who remained strangers for 7 years of marriage until she died, bringing our stillborn son into the world," and Eleanor felt her heart clench with unexpected pain for this proud, difficult man. "She was unhappy," he said, "and I was too proud, or too foolish to see it until it was too late. And I have spent every day since wondering if I could have done something differently if I had only tried to know her," and Eleanor found herself speaking before she could stop the words. "My mother married my father for duty, and she never let any of us forget the sacrifice she had made, and I watched her grow bitter and cold year after year until there was nothing left of the woman she might have been." And Frederick turned to her then, with an expression of such profound understanding that she felt something shift between them. "I would never wish that fate upon you," he said, "nor would I want a wife who came to me out of obligation, which is why I wait for you to choose me freely." And across the room, Eleanor caught sight of Lady Beatrice watching them with narrowed, calculating eyes. But for once she found she did not care what the gossips might say, because in this moment, surrounded by terrible music and whispered confessions, she had glimpsed the man beneath the title, and what she saw there terrified her almost as much as it drew her inexorably closer. The invitation to tea at Ravenscroft House arrived on the morning of May the 28th, 1815, and Eleanor stared at the elegant cream-coloured card with its embossed ducal crest as though it might transform into a serpent in her hands. For she understood immediately what this summons meant, and the knowledge filled her with a dread so profound she could barely breathe. And Harriet found her still standing frozen in the hallway 10 minutes later, with the card clutched between white-knuckled fingers. "Oh, Eleanor," her sister whispered, reading the invitation over her shoulder. "This is either very good news or very bad news, and I cannot determine which." And Eleanor laughed, though the sound held no mirth. "His mother wishes to inspect me like livestock at market," she said, "and I suspect I shall be found wanting in every possible regard." But she went nonetheless because Frederick had asked her in his own note, tucked inside the formal invitation, and because some foolish part of her heart, that she could no longer silence, wanted to prove herself worthy of his continued attention, And so at precisely 4 o'clock that afternoon, she found herself perched on the edge of an impossibly elegant settee in the grand drawing-room of Ravenscroft House, with its soaring ceilings painted with cherubs and its walls hung with portraits of ancestors who seemed to glare down at her with collective disapproval. And across from her sat Constance Ravenscroft, the Dowager Duchess of Thornhill, a woman of 60 years whose silver hair was swept up in an elaborate arrangement and whose cold blue eyes missed nothing as they travelled over Eleanor's modest muslin gown and simple pearl earrings with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "So you are the Ashworth girl," the Dowager said without preamble, her voice sharp as cut glass, "the one who made such a spectacle of refusing my son, and who has somehow convinced him to make a greater spectacle of pursuing her for over a year now." Eleanor felt Frederick tense beside her on the settee, but she lifted her chin and met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I am Lady Eleanor Ashworth. Your Grace, daughter of Viscount Ashworth, and I made no spectacle beyond speaking honestly when honesty was warranted," and the Dowager's lips thinned into a line of displeasure. Honesty, she repeated, as though the word offended her. "Let me be honest, then, since you value the quality so highly, for you are a woman of 27 years, with a dowry that would barely keep a household in candles, and a family whose consequence has dwindled with each passing generation, and I cannot fathom what my son sees in you that he could not find in 100 other women of superior birth and fortune." Mother Frederick's voice was low and dangerous, but the Dowager silenced him with a raised hand, and Eleanor felt something crack within her chest, though she refused to let it show on her face. "You are quite right." "Your Grace," she said, rising to her feet, with a dignity she did not feel. "I am none of the things a duke should want in a wife, and I have told your son as much on numerous occasions, but he persists, and I begin to think perhaps the failing lies not in my worth, but in the narrowness of how worth is measured in drawing-rooms such as this one." And she turned and walked from the room, with her head held high, though her heart was shattering with every step, and she had barely reached the entrance hall when she heard Frederick's footsteps behind her and felt his hand catch her elbow. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and she turned to find his silver-grey eyes blazing with something that looked almost like anguish. "I will handle my mother. I swear to you her opinions are not mine, and they never will be." And Eleanor looked at this proud, stubborn, impossible man, and felt the last of her defences begin to crumble. The morning of June the 3rd, 1815, broke grey and cool over Hyde Park, and Eleanor had risen before dawn, unable to sleep after another night spent staring at her ceiling and replaying the Dowager's cruel words in her mind until they had carved themselves into her heart like inscriptions on a tomb, and she had slipped from the house in her dark green riding habit without waking Harriet, because she needed to think, and she could only think properly when she was moving, and so she rode alone through the mist-shrouded paths, with only the distant call of birds and the soft thud of hooves on damp earth for company. And she had nearly convinced herself that she knew what must be done when she heard another horse approaching and turned to find Frederick emerging from the fog like some spectre conjured by her troubled thoughts, his dark hair dishevelled and his silver-grey eyes shadowed as though he too had not slept. And before she could speak, he said, "I went to your house, and Harriet told me you had gone riding, and I knew I would find you here because I know you, Eleanor. I know that when you are troubled, you seek movement and solitude, and I know that my mother has troubled you deeply." And Eleanor pulled her horse to a stop beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches spread above them like a canopy, and she made herself say the words she had rehearsed through all those sleepless hours. "You must stop this, Frederick," she said, and her voice did not waver, though her heart was breaking. "You must find someone suitable, someone your mother would welcome, someone who would not bring whispers and scandal to your name." And Frederick dismounted in one fluid motion and came to stand beside her horse, looking up at her with an expression that stripped away every defense she had ever built. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he asked. "I see the only woman in London who has ever treated me as a man rather than a title. I see someone whose wit delights me, whose courage humbles me, whose stubborn refusal to pretend has made me more honest than I have ever been." And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as he continued, "My mother sees fortune and lineage and social advantage. But I see you, Eleanor. I see the way you laugh when you think no one is watching, and the way you defend those who cannot defend themselves, and the way you have made me want to be worthy of someone for the first time in my life." And he reached up then and took her gloved hand in his, and the warmth of his touch burned through the thin leather, and Eleanor did not pull away. "I cannot promise you that society will be kind," he said, "but I can promise you that I will spend every day of my life trying to make you happy if you will only let me." And as the first pale rays of sunlight broke through the morning mist and turned the dew on the grass to scattered diamonds, Eleanor looked down at this proud, stubborn, impossible man who had pursued her for more than a year, despite every obstacle, and she felt something shift within her chest, like a door opening onto a room she had kept locked for far too long. The third season opened on the evening of April 12th, 1816, and Eleanor found herself seated in the Duke of Thornhill's private box at the King's Theatre, watching the opening act of Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro, while acutely aware that half the opera house was watching her rather than the stage, for she had become in these 2 years of Frederick's persistent courtship something of a curiosity to London society, and she could feel the weight of their collective gaze like a physical pressure against her skin. And beside her, Frederick sat with his silver-grey eyes fixed not on the performers below, but on her profile, as though she were the only spectacle worth observing. And Eleanor had chosen her gown with more care than she would ever admit, selecting a deep rose silk that brought colour to her cheeks and made her feel for the first time in many seasons almost beautiful. And during the first intermission, when the house lights rose and the murmur of conversation swelled around them, Frederick leaned close enough that she could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, and asked in a low voice, "Tell me what would convince you?" And Eleanor turned to meet his gaze, her heart stuttering at the intensity she found there. "Convince me of what?" she asked, though she knew perfectly well what he meant. "That I am sincere." He said that this is not a game or a pursuit of conquest, but something far more terrifying and wonderful. And Eleanor looked out over the crowded theatre at the faces turned toward them, with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. And she saw Thomas Colburn standing in the pit below, staring up at their box with an expression of barely concealed malice. And she saw Lady Beatrice Greville whispering behind her fan to a circle of eager listeners, and she felt the familiar fear rise within her chest, the fear that she would wake one morning to find this had all been an elaborate dream. "I do not know," she admitted finally, and the honesty of the words surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "You have been patient beyond reason," she continued, "and you have shown me kindness. I did not expect, and you have made me feel things I had long since given up, hoping to feel. But there is still some part of me that waits for the deception to reveal itself." And Frederick reached out then and took her hand in full view of anyone who cared to look, and the gasps that rippled through the nearby boxes were audible even over the orchestra tuning below. "Then I shall simply have to continue proving myself," he said, "until that part of you is silenced forever." And Eleanor felt the warmth of his fingers wrapped around hers, and she thought of how far they had come from that first terrible proposal, and she allowed herself for just one moment to imagine what it might feel like to say yes. The garden party at Hartwell Manor on the afternoon of May 15th, 1816, was precisely the sort of affair Eleanor had learned to navigate with practiced ease over her many seasons, and she moved through the manicured paths with a glass of lemonade in her gloved hand, nodding politely to acquaintances while searching for a quiet corner where she might escape the endless speculation about her relationship with the Duke of Thornhill. And she had nearly found sanctuary in the elaborate hedge maze at the far end of the grounds when she heard footsteps behind her and turned expecting to find Frederick, but instead discovering the unwelcome figure of Thomas Colborne blocking her path with a smile that did not reach his pale eyes. "Lady Eleanor," he said, stepping closer so that she was forced to retreat deeper into the maze. "You have been avoiding me, and I confess I find it most vexing when I have made my intentions toward you abundantly clear." And Eleanor felt her heart begin to race with something that was not flattery but fear, as she recognized the determination in his stance, and the way his gaze traveled over her with proprietary assessment. "Mr. Colborne," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I have given you no encouragement, and I must ask you to let me pass." But Thomas only moved closer until she could smell the wine on his breath and see the flush of anger rising in his cheeks. "You think yourself too good for me now that you have caught a duke's attention?" he hissed. "But we both know he will never marry you, and when he tires of this game, you will come crawling back to those of us willing to overlook your advancing years and your family's meager circumstances." And Eleanor opened her mouth to deliver a sharp retort when a voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade drawn from its sheath. "You will step away from Lady Eleanor immediately," Frederick said, emerging from between the hedges, with his silver-grey eyes blazing with a cold fury that Eleanor had never witnessed in all their acquaintance, and Thomas Colborne visibly paled as he recognized the barely restrained violence in the Duke's posture. "Your Grace," Thomas stammered, "this is merely a private conversation between myself and the lady." "There is nothing private about cornering an unwilling woman in a secluded location," Frederick replied, and his voice was terrifyingly calm, even as his hands clenched at his sides, and Eleanor watched in breathless silence as he continued. "If I ever see you approach Lady Eleanor again, if I hear so much as a whisper that you have spoken her name with anything less than the utmost respect, I will ensure that every door in London closes to you permanently. And that is not a threat, Mr. Colborne. It is a promise from a man who has the means and the inclination to destroy you utterly." And Thomas fled without another word, leaving Eleanor alone with Frederick in the green-shadowed maze, and she found herself trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this man who had pursued her so patiently for 2 years had just revealed the depth of his feeling in his fierce protection of her honor. "Frederick," she whispered, and he turned to her with all the anger draining from his face, replaced by tender concern as he reached out and took her hand in his, and this time she let him hold it for a long moment, feeling the warmth of his touch seep through her gloves and into her very bones. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, and Eleanor shook her head, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat as she understood at last that whatever else might be uncertain in this world, Frederick's devotion to her was not. The storm arrived without warning on the evening of May 28, 1816, transforming what had been a pleasant house party at Lord Philip Sinclair's country estate into a study of nature's sudden fury, and Eleanor found herself separated from the other guests when the first thunderclap shook the windows and sent her hurrying from the music room toward what she hoped would be shelter in the library, only to discover upon entering that Frederick had sought the same refuge, and now stood by the tall windows watching the rain lash against the glass, with an expression of quiet contemplation that shifted to something warmer when he turned and saw her standing in the doorway, with raindrops still glittering in her hair from her dash across the open gallery. And for a long moment neither of them spoke as the storm raged outside, and the fire crackled in the hearth, and the hundreds of leather-bound volumes surrounding them seemed to create a world apart from everything Eleanor had ever known. "You are wet," he said finally, crossing to where she stood, and before she could protest, he had removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders, and the warmth of it carried his scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely him that made her breath catch in her throat. "I should find the others," Eleanor murmured, but she made no move toward the door, and Frederick seemed to understand that her words were merely the last vestiges of propriety speaking, because he guided her gently toward the settee near the fire, and sat beside her close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the fine wool of his coat. "The others will manage without us." For a little while, he said, and there was something different in his voice tonight, something raw and unguarded that Eleanor had only glimpsed before in fragments, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him, as though drawn by a force she could no longer resist. "Eleanor." He said her name like a prayer, like a question, like an answer all at once, and when she looked up and met his silver-grey eyes, she saw reflected there everything she had been afraid to name within herself. "Tell me," he whispered, and his hand came up to cup her cheek so tenderly that she felt tears spring to her eyes. "Tell me what you are thinking right now in this moment." And Eleanor opened her mouth to deflect, to make some clever remark that would restore the safe distance between them, but what emerged instead was the truth, stripped bare of all pretense. "I am thinking that I am terrified," she said. And her voice trembled as the rain hammered against the windows and the firelight painted shadows across his beloved face. "I am terrified because I know now that I love you, and I do not know how to be brave enough to let you love me back." And Frederick made a sound that was almost a sob, and leaned toward her, and for one heart-stopping moment Eleanor thought he would kiss her, and she wanted him to. Wanted it with an intensity that shocked her, but at the last instant she turned her head, and his lips brushed her temple instead, and he pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "Then I will wait," he said. And each word was a vow, until you are ready, until you are certain, until you can say yes without fear, because, Eleanor, you are worth every moment of waiting, and I would spend 100 seasons proving that to you, if that is what you need. The final ball of the third season arrived on July the 2nd, 1816, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowded ballroom, feeling the weight of another year pressing against her heart as she watched couples swirl across the polished floor, and wondered how she had come to be 28 years old and still unable to say the simple word that would change everything. And she sensed Frederick's approach before she saw him, drawn to his presence by some visible thread that had woven itself between them over the course of 3 long years, and when he appeared at her side, his silver-grey eyes held that particular softness that was reserved for her alone, and she felt her pulse quicken as it always did when he looked at her this way. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "will you walk with me?" And she nodded, unable to refuse him anything tonight. Even though she knew what was coming, knew it with the certainty of someone who had learned to read every nuance of his expression. And they moved together through the open doors onto the terrace, where the summer air was thick with the scent of roses, and the distant sound of music drifted after them like a half-remembered dream. "I have something to ask you," he said, when they had found a quiet corner away from curious eyes, and Eleanor felt tears threatening, because she loved him. She loved him with every fractured piece of her guarded heart, and yet the fear still lived within her, coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. "Frederick," she began, but he raised a hand gently, and the moonlight caught the planes of his face, transforming him into something almost ethereal. "Let me speak," he said, and his voice trembled slightly, which undid her more than any grand declaration could have done. "I have loved you for 3 seasons. Eleanor and I believe you have come to care for me as well. And so I must ask you now, not with arrogance as I did that first night, but with humility and hope, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" And Eleanor felt the word yes rising in her throat, felt it burning to be spoken, but something held it back, some last desperate grip of the fear she had carried for so long. And what emerged instead was a whispered "not yet," and she watched his face carefully for signs of anger or frustration, but found only understanding and a patience that made her want to weep. "Then I will ask again," he said simply, "next season, and the one after that, and every season until you are ready. Or until you tell me there is no hope." And Eleanor reached for his hand, then deliberately choosing to touch him, needing him to know that her hesitation was not rejection, and he caught her fingers and held them as though they were something precious beyond measure. "Dance with me," she said, surprising herself, and his eyes widened, because she had never accepted before, had always refused this particular intimacy. But tonight she needed to be in his arms, needed to feel the solid warmth of him. And so they returned to the ballroom together, and when he led her onto the floor and placed his hand at her waist, Eleanor felt something shift within her as they moved together in perfect harmony. And she thought perhaps next season she would finally find the courage to say yes. The fourth season opened not with a ball or a grand social occasion, but with a quiet afternoon in April 1817, when Eleanor found herself wandering the familiar aisles of Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, seeking solace among the leather-bound volumes that had always offered her refuge from the world's demands. And she was 29 years old now, an age that society had long since declared beyond hope. Yet something had shifted within her over the long winter months, something that felt remarkably like certainty. Growing stronger with each letter Frederick had written to her from his country estate. Letters filled not with declarations, but with observations about his tenants, and questions about her reading, and small details of his daily life that made her feel as though she were there beside him. And so when she turned a corner in the narrow aisle, dedicated to botanical works, and found him standing there with a volume in his hands, she felt not surprise, but rather the rightness of his presence, as though the universe had conspired to bring them together in this quiet space where they could simply be themselves without the weight of society's watching eyes. "You are here," she said, and the words were inadequate to express the joy that bloomed in her chest at the sight of him. But Frederick seemed to understand, because his silver-grey eyes softened in that way that was reserved for her alone, and he held up the book he had been examining, a treatise on the design of estate gardens. "I was hoping to find something that might help me reimagine the grounds at Thornhill," he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice, as though he were confessing a secret. "I have been thinking about what you said last season, about the importance of creating spaces where one might wander and think, and I wondered if perhaps you might help me choose something suitable." And Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, because this man who could have anything, who could command the finest landscape architects in England, was standing in a bookshop asking for her opinion, as though it mattered more than any expert's counsel. And she moved to stand beside him in the narrow aisle, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm as she reached for another volume, and the contact sent warmth spreading through her. "Tell me," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice, "what do you imagine our life would be?" And Frederick went very still beside her, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion. "I imagine mornings in the library," he said, "with you reading beside the fire while I attend to correspondence, and I imagine walking through gardens you helped design, and I imagine evenings spent talking about everything and nothing, and I imagine growing old with you, Eleanor, watching the seasons change year after year, knowing that whatever comes we face it together." And Eleanor closed her eyes against the beauty of his vision, feeling the last of her fears begin to crumble, because this was what she wanted. This quiet, certain love that had been proven through patience and constancy, and she knew with absolute clarity that this would be the season she finally said yes. The message arrived on a grey morning in May 1817, delivered by Frederick's own footman, and Eleanor read the carefully penned words with trembling hands as she learned that the Dowager Duchess had requested her presence at Ravenscroft House, and the letter included a note from Frederick himself explaining that his mother's health had declined significantly over the winter months and that she had expressed a specific desire to speak with Eleanor alone, and so Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing a gown of soft lavender that spoke of respectfulness without severity. And she made her way through the familiar streets of Mayfair with her heart pounding against her ribs because she remembered every cutting word the Dowager had spoken 2 years ago, remembered the cold assessment of her inadequate fortune and undistinguished family. And she wondered what could possibly have prompted this summons now, when everything between herself and Frederick had grown so tender and certain. Frederick met her at the door of Ravenscroft House, his silver-grey eyes shadowed with worry and gratitude mingled together, and he pressed her hand briefly before leading her up the grand staircase to the sick-room, where pale sunlight filtered through gauze curtains, and the Dowager lay propped against pillows, looking diminished in a way that made Eleanor's breath catch because illness had stripped away the formidable presence she remembered leaving behind, only a frail woman with papery skin and eyes that held something Eleanor had never expected to see there, which was regret. Lady Eleanor, the Dowager said, and her voice was thin but steady. "Please come closer. I have something I must say to you." And Eleanor moved to the chair beside the bed, acutely aware of Frederick hovering in the doorway behind her, and she sat and folded her hands in her lap and waited with the patience that 4 years of loving his son had taught her. "I was wrong," the Dowager said simply, and the words seemed to cost her greatly. "I looked at you and saw only what you lacked instead of what you possessed. And I treated you with cruelty when you had shown my son nothing but honesty. And I am asking for your forgiveness, not because I deserve it, but because I find I cannot leave this world with such a weight upon my conscience." And Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she reached out and took the Dowager's thin hand in her own. "You are forgiven," Eleanor said, and she meant it completely, meant it without reservation, because she understood now that fear took many forms, and the Dowager had simply been afraid for her son, afraid that he would be hurt again after his disastrous first marriage, afraid that Eleanor's sharp tongue and independent spirit would bring him pain instead of joy. The Dowager's eyes glistened, and she turned her head slightly toward the doorway where Frederick stood frozen, and Eleanor knew he had heard everything, and when the Dowager spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, but the words carried clearly across the quiet room. "There is a ring," she said, "that has belonged to the Duchesses of Thornhill for 6 generations, and I want you to have it, Eleanor, because I have watched my son love you with a constancy I did not believe him capable of, and I know now that you are worthy of him and of this family, and I give you my blessing with my whole heart." So the end came in the smallest hours of the night, when the world outside Ravenscroft House lay silent and still, and Eleanor sat beside Frederick in the dimly lit sick-room, watching the Dowager's breathing grow ever more shallow, and she had not intended to stay so long, had meant only to visit for an hour. But when the physician had emerged with grave news, and Frederick's face had gone pale, Eleanor had found it impossible to leave him, and so she had remained through the evening and into the night. Propriety be damned, because the man she loved needed her, and nothing else mattered. And at 3 a.m, with a single candle flickering on the bedside table, the Dowager Duchess drew her final breath and slipped away, and the silence that followed was the most profound Eleanor had ever known, broken only by the soft sound of Frederick's breathing, which had grown ragged and uneven, and she watched as he bent forward in his chair, his head dropping into his hands, and his broad shoulders beginning to shake with the force of grief he could no longer contain. And Eleanor did not think she simply moved, rising from her own chair, and crossing to kneel beside him, and she wrapped her arms around him and held him as he wept. And there were no words adequate to this moment, no phrases that could ease the pain of losing a mother, no matter how complicated that relationship had been, and so she offered only her presence, her warmth, her steady heartbeat against his, and Frederick turned into her embrace and buried his face against her shoulder, and she felt his tears soaking through the fabric of her gown, and she did not care, because this was what love meant. This was what all those seasons of patience and proving had been building toward, not grand declarations in moonlit gardens. But this, the willingness to sit with someone in their darkest hour and simply be there. And they remained like that for a long time, as the candle burned lower and the first hints of grey began to appear at the edges of the curtained windows. And eventually Frederick's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, and then into stillness. And when he finally raised his head, his silver-grey eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but there was something else there too, a kind of wonder as he looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. And he reached up and touched her face with trembling fingers, and Eleanor leaned into his palm and closed her eyes, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was the man she would marry, that she could not imagine facing another day, another season, another moment without him beside her. And when the dawn light finally broke through the gaps in the curtains, painting the room in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor understood that something had shifted irrevocably between them, that grief had accomplished what 4 seasons of courtship could not quite complete, which was to strip away every last barrier, every lingering fear, every reason she had ever given herself for holding back. And she was ready now, ready to say yes, ready to become his wife, ready to build the life he had described in the bookshop. And she pressed a kiss to his forehead and whispered, "I am here." And Frederick closed his eyes and whispered back, "I know." And it was enough. The Pemberton Ball blazed with candlelight on the evening of April 15th, 1818, and Eleanor stood at the entrance to the same ballroom where 5 years ago she had uttered the words that had changed everything, and she felt the weight of her mother's garnets resting against her collarbone, exactly as they had that fateful night. But everything else about her had transformed, because the woman who had arrived here in 1814, resigned and bitter and convinced of her own invisibility, had become someone else entirely, someone who had been gummed with a patience and constancy that had slowly dismantled every wall she had ever built. And Eleanor was 30 years old now, an age that society whispered was far beyond hope. But she had never felt more beautiful, more certain, more ready for whatever the evening would bring, and she wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that caught the light when she moved, and her hair was swept up in an elegant style that Harriet had helped her perfect, and when she entered the room she felt the familiar weight of 100 curious gazes. But this time she did not shrink from them, because she knew who she was, and she knew who waited for her somewhere in this glittering crowd. Lady Beatrice Greville stood near the refreshment table, her sharp eyes tracking Eleanor's entrance, and Eleanor could see the woman calculating, assessing, preparing some cutting remark about spinsters who refused to accept their fate. But Eleanor merely inclined her head in polite acknowledgement and moved deeper into the room, because Lady Beatrice's opinions had long since ceased to matter. And then she saw him standing near the same pillar where he had stood 5 years ago, his silver-grey eyes finding hers across the crowded ballroom with an intensity that made her breath catch, and Frederick looked distinguished in his dark evening clothes, his hair showing the faintest threads of silver at the temples. Now, and the sight of him made Eleanor's heart swell with a love so vast she wondered how she had ever thought she could live without it, and he began to move toward her, cutting through the crowd with the same purposeful stride she remembered from that first night. And Eleanor stayed exactly where she was, letting him come to her because she was done running, hiding, and pretending she did not want precisely this. And when he reached her side, the murmurs rose around them because everyone remembered. Everyone knew the story of the Duke who had pursued the sharp-tongued spinster through 5 seasons. And they were all watching to see how this chapter would end. Lady Eleanor Frederick said, and his voice was low and warm and familiar, and it wrapped around her like a homecoming. "I believe you owe me a walk in the garden." And Eleanor smiled up at him with all the love she had spent years learning to feel, and she placed her gloved hand in his and said, "I believe you are right." Your Grace, and together they turned toward the terrace doors and the moonlit garden beyond. The garden lay silver and shadow beneath the April moon, and Eleanor walked beside Frederick along the same gravel path where 5 years ago she had stood alone and invisible, and convinced that no man of consequence would ever truly see her. And now his hand was warm around hers, and the night air carried the scent of early roses, and somewhere behind them the ballroom glowed with candlelight and hummed with the voices of 100 guests who were surely wondering what was happening between the Duke of Thornhill and the woman who had once rejected him before all of London. And Frederick led her to a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree. And when they stopped walking, Eleanor could feel the tremor in his fingers, and she realized with a rush of tenderness that he was nervous, that despite 5 seasons of patient pursuit, despite weathering her sharp tongue and her stubborn fears, and his mother's opposition and society's endless whispers, he was still uncertain of her answer, and this vulnerability in a man so powerful made her love him even more fiercely than she had thought possible. And Frederick turned to face her, and in the moonlight his silver-grey eyes held an intensity that stole her breath. And he said, "Eleanor, I have asked you this question before, and each time you have told me not yet, and I have accepted that answer because I would rather wait a lifetime for you than spend a single day with anyone else." And she felt tears pricking at her eyes as he continued. "And 5 years ago, in this very garden, I approached you with arrogance and presumption, believing my title was enough to recommend me, and you showed me how wrong I was, and I have spent every season since trying to become worthy of you, trying to prove that I see you truly, that I love your sharp wit, and your tender heart, and your stubborn courage, and your quiet kindness, and I love the way you read in gardens, and the way you know the Latin names of flowers, and the way you held me when my mother died, and the way you refuse to be anything other than exactly who you are." And Frederick reached into his coat and withdrew a ring that Eleanor recognized as the Ravenscroft family heirloom, the one his mother had offered from her sickbed, and he held it between them, glinting in the moonlight. And he said, "Lady Eleanor Ashworth, I am asking you for the final time, will you marry me?" And Eleanor looked at this man who had proven himself across 5 seasons, who had defended her honor and earned her trust and held her hand through grief. And she remembered her own words from that first night when she had declared she would not marry him for all of London. And she smiled through her tears and said, "I would not marry you for all of London." Frederick, and she watched his face begin to fall before she reached up and cupped his cheek and continued, "But I will marry you for love." And the joy that broke across his features was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms and kissed her beneath the oak tree with the moon as their witness. And Eleanor kissed him back with all the love she had spent years learning to feel. When they returned to the ballroom, hand in hand with Eleanor, wearing the Ravenscroft ring upon her finger, the whispers began immediately spreading through the assembled guests like fire through dry summer grass, and Lady Beatrice Greville's face went pale with shock as she watched the Duke of Thornhill lead the woman she had mocked for 5 seasons toward the center of the dance floor, and Frederick raised his hand, and the musicians fell silent, and every eye in the Pemberton ballroom turned toward them, and Frederick spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the glittering room, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of announcing my engagement to Lady Eleanor Ashworth, the most remarkable woman I have ever known," and the silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before Lord Philip Sinclair began to applaud, and then Harriet was crying and clapping, and then the room erupted in a wave of congratulations that drowned out whatever cutting remark Lady Beatrice had been preparing. And Eleanor stood beside Frederick feeling the weight of 100 gazes, but this time every one of them saw her, truly saw her, and the orchestra began to play, and Frederick turned to her and said, "I believe you owe me a dance, my love." And Eleanor laughed and let him lead her onto the floor, and as they moved together through the steps of a waltz. She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, bitter and resigned, and convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people. And she thought about all the seasons between then and now, the garden conversations, and the whispered confidences, and the storm that had trapped them in Lord Philip's library, and the night she had held Frederick while he wept for his mother, and she understood now that love was not a single moment of declaration, but rather 1,000 small choices made day after day, season after season, and Frederick had made those choices consistently, patiently, devotedly, until Eleanor had finally learned to believe that she was worthy of being loved. And as they danced, she looked up into his silver-grey eyes and said, "I am sorry I made you wait so long." And Frederick smiled down at her with all the tenderness of 5 years of patient pursuit, and said, "I would have waited 5 more. I would have waited forever." And Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, and she said, "I know, and that is why I love you." And when the waltz ended, Frederick kept her hand in his, and they stood together at the edge of the dance floor, receiving congratulations from guests who had once whispered about the persistent Duke and the stubborn spinster, and now whispered about the greatest love story London had ever seen. And Harriet embraced Eleanor with tears streaming down her face and said, "I always knew." And Lord Philip shook Frederick's hand and said, "It took you long enough, old friend," and even Lady Beatrice approached, though her congratulations were delivered through gritted teeth, and Eleanor accepted them all graciously because she had finally become the woman Frederick had always seen when he looked at her, and the night stretched on in a golden haze of music and champagne and stolen glances, and when the clock struck midnight, Eleanor and Frederick slipped away to the garden once more and stood beneath the oak tree where everything had changed, and Frederick kissed her again and whispered against her lips, "Welcome home." They were married 6 weeks later in the chapel at Thornhill Park, with spring sunlight streaming through the ancient stained glass windows and casting jeweled patterns across the stone floor, and Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a gown of ivory silk and her mother's garnets at her throat. And when she reached Frederick at the altar and saw the tears glistening in his silver-grey eyes, she understood that every moment of the past 5 years had been leading to this sacred space, where they would finally become one. And the ceremony passed in a golden blur of spoken vows and exchanged rings. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Frederick kissed her with such tender reverence that Eleanor heard Harriet sobbing somewhere behind them and felt her own tears sliding down her cheeks, and afterward they emerged into the May sunshine where the tenants and villagers had gathered to cheer for their Duke and his unlikely Duchess. And Eleanor looked out at the sea of smiling faces and thought about how far she had travelled from that bitter, resigned woman who had stood invisible at the edges of ballrooms, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. And Frederick took her hand and led her toward the wedding breakfast. And throughout the celebrations that followed, he rarely left her side, and when he did, His eyes always found their way back to her as if he still could not quite believe she was truly his. And that evening, after the guests had departed and the great house had fallen quiet, Frederick led Eleanor up the grand staircase to the suite of rooms that would now be hers, and he paused outside the door and looked at her with an expression of such profound tenderness that it stole her breath. And he said, "I have waited 5 years for this moment, and now that it is here, I find myself almost afraid to believe it is real." And Eleanor reached up and touched his face and said, "I am real, Frederick. I am yours, and I am not going anywhere." And he kissed her then with all the passion he had held in check through 5 seasons of patient courtship. And Eleanor kissed him back. And when he finally opened the door and drew her inside, she went willingly, joyfully into the new life they would build together. And in the weeks and months that followed, Eleanor discovered that marriage to Frederick was nothing like the cold arrangement she had feared, and everything like the partnership she had secretly hoped for, and they spent their days riding across the estate and their evenings reading together in the library, and their nights discovering each other in ways that made Eleanor blush to remember come morning. And Frederick continued to surprise her with his thoughtfulness, leaving botanical specimens on her pillow and books about gardens on her writing desk, and small notes tucked into unexpected places, declaring his love in words both tender and occasionally quite improper. And Eleanor surprised herself by becoming the kind of wife who left notes of her own, and who reached for his hand in public, and who no longer cared what society whispered, because she had learned at last that the only opinion that mattered was that of the man who had spent 5 seasons proving that she was worth waiting for. And when autumn came, and the leaves turned gold and crimson, Eleanor realized that she was carrying their first child, and the joy on Frederick's face when she told him was brighter than any sunrise she had ever seen. Their daughter was born on a February morning in 1819, when snow lay thick upon the grounds of Thornhill Park, and the fires blazed high in every hearth, and Eleanor labored through the long hours of the night, with Frederick pacing the corridor outside her chamber, because propriety demanded he remain apart, though he had argued fiercely against it until Eleanor herself had sent him away with a tired smile and a promise that she would be well, and when at last the thin cry of a newborn pierced the silence of the great house, Frederick burst through the door without waiting for permission, and found Eleanor propped against a mountain of pillows with a tiny bundle cradled against her breast, and the look on her face was one of such transcendent joy that Frederick felt his knees weaken beneath him, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed and looked down at the small, perfect face of his daughter, and felt tears sliding down his cheeks without shame. And Eleanor reached out and touched his face and said, "She has your eyes, Frederick." And he looked and saw that it was true. The baby had opened her eyes, and they were silver grey, like winter skies, and Frederick whispered, "What shall we call her?" And Eleanor smiled and said, "I thought perhaps Constance, after your mother," and Frederick's breath caught in his throat because he had not expected this generosity, this grace from the woman his mother had once tried so hard to drive away, and he kissed Eleanor's forehead and said, "You are remarkable. Do you know that?" And Eleanor laughed softly and said, "You have been telling me so for 5 years. I am beginning to believe it." And in the months that followed, little Constance grew and thrived, and Eleanor discovered that motherhood suited her in ways she had never imagined, and Frederick proved to be the kind of father who could be found on the nursery floor building towers of blocks, and who sang slightly off-key lullabies, and who looked at his daughter with the same patient, devoted love he had once lavished entirely upon Eleanor, and their happiness seemed to expand to accommodate this new love without diminishing what they felt for each other. And when Harriet visited with Rose, who was now 4 years old, the cousins played together in the gardens, while the sisters sat on the terrace and watched, and Harriet said, I remember when you told me you would never marry, that you had made peace with being alone." And Eleanor smiled and said, "I remember too. I was so certain that love was something that happened to other people, and Harriet took her hand and said, 'What changed?' And Eleanor considered the question carefully, because she had asked herself the same thing many times over the years. And finally she said, 'Frederick refused to let me disappear. He saw me when I had convinced myself I was invisible, and he kept seeing me, season after season, until I learned to see myself through his eyes.' And Harriet wiped tears from her cheeks and said, 'That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard.' And Eleanor laughed and said, 'Do not let him hear you say that his pride is insufferable enough already.' And from across the garden Frederick called out, 'I heard that,' and both sisters dissolved into laughter, and the sound carried across the grounds of Thornhill Park like music.